Hi, welcome to Simply Thoughts. This is my first podcast. So I'm going to introduce it by saying that this podcast is called Simply Thoughts, which is kind of a, what's that word they use in TV shows? A spin off, or I guess you could say a crossover, because I'm in a band with my fellow bandmate Karina, who's a bassist and vocalist, and she's going to be guest starring as well many times. And basically, what this podcast is about, I think you could hear me better now, is simply thoughts, just like the title, which essentially is about thoughts, questions about life, inspirations, books we're reading, public figures or artists that I'm inspired by, thoughts that I get in my daily life about ranging from philosophical questions, don't mind my accent. Just a side note, I'm English, but I do have a slight accent because I grew up in a French-speaking home, but thankfully I learned English, and sometimes there are certain words that I have accents upon, but that's okay. It's about being authentic and being oneself, and so anyways, Simply Thoughts is going through different thoughts and discussing them, whether it be books we're reading, certain questions about life, all the way to nonsense. So, I want to start off this podcast by talking about a book that I'm reading right now. I haven't read in a while. Spent 4 years in university reading every single week, and took a long break from reading. I studied psychology at McGill, and I've learned exuberant amounts of information, which I'm so thankful that I did. And so anyways, I got back into reading. It's been a while that I haven't read. Being someone that has ADHD, sometimes I'll start a book. Last time I started a book, and then I quickly ended it, and then I read a few pages, and then I stop for a while. I get distracted with something else, and then, long story short, I stuck with this one. And so it's called Zen and the Art of the Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig, which was written in 1974. It's considered a very, I guess you could say it's a modern classic. It is considered a classic in philosophy as well as fiction. But it's important to note that this book is actually not all fiction, because it's based on a true story. And in essence, what it's about, Robert Pirsig, who was going about in across the United States motorcycle trip with his son, Chris. And that is based on a true story, and the fact that he was in fact a professor as well. We found out later in the book. And the book basically has two things going on at the same time, two narratives. You have the beautiful articulate descriptions of the trip that they're doing in Montana and Utah, in New Mexico, all across the United States, and the details that he puts in describing the landscape, in describing the mountains, in describing all of the landscape, the prairies, is insurmountable in its beauty. And you get a very, very clear visual in your head of these landscapes and the feelings. I have to say he's a fantastic writer, and I really enjoy that. And then you have on the other side, simultaneously, he touches upon what he calls his alter ego Phaedrus, and Chautauquas, which is kind of a native word that describes bits of knowledge, bits of thoughts. And Phaedrus is his alter ego, which we later on find out. I'm not giving any spoilers, but he was attainted with mental illness, and back in the 60s and the 70s, he got electroshock therapy, and he kind of forgot that part of him that was mentally ill, or back then they call it a nervous breakdown, but I suppose it seems to me like he was suffering from either a major depression episode combined with some psychotic features. Side note, yes, I studied psychology, but I'm not diagnosing anything official, because sorry, I was just checking because I have someone coming over. But anyways, he was attained with mental illness. As the book progresses, he's uncovering little bouts of knowledge, because that half part of the book where he's uncovering that part of him that was mentally ill and the memories he had before he got electroshock therapy, which essentially made him forget the moments prior to him getting treatment, which he forgot all his parts, the temporal timeline of all the moments before, all the fragments of memory come back to him prior to him getting treatment and electroshock therapy, which essentially made him forget his past. So that narrative also touches upon a lot of great philosophical masters, from Eastern philosophy to Western philosophy, such as Kant and Hegel, and then you have classics such as Plato. And he's basically obsessed with the truth, the absolute truth, and essentially getting to the root of truth and knowledge. And that narrative deals with all these different philosophical nodes, and essentially getting deeper and deeper into them. And it's very interesting because it really makes you think, and it gives you a perspective on things and on life. And you don't have to be versed in philosophy in order to read this book. Yes, it does help a little bit, but he does introduce the concepts and themes and from different philosophical figures. He doesn't necessarily go into deep iceberg into it. However, it does open up realms of philosophy. If you've never studied philosophy before, or if you have, it touches upon certain philosophical figures and major ones that could open up more knowledge for you. And I had a little bit of knowledge of philosophy. I've read a lot about it for fun as well. When I was in university, I took some courses in feminist theory. I took courses in I had a minor in sexual diversity, so I did come across a lot of philosophical figures within feminist theory, and as well as on my free time, I read a lot about it. I read and watched documentaries, and one of my really good friends studied a lot of philosophy for fun, and I learned a lot through him. And to this day, we still discuss a lot of philosophical questions and problems and things that really you try to prune the layers more and more and more, and you try to get to the tip of it, which pretty much is the question of life. So from existentialism, some words I have trouble repeating, please forgive me, but in my head it's very clear. Existential nihilism to Eastern philosophy. So he touches upon all those topics, pretty much to get to the truth, absolute truth. And there's some things in the book, as I'm reading it, I take notes of things that really resonate with me or leave a mark, that really gives you a different dimension of looking at the world. And, I strongly recommend this book for everyone. You don't have to be a university educated in university to read it. However, I will say that there are some dense topics that you do have to sometimes reread the sentences a few times, or he uses very articulate word. Some reviewers say, he goes a lot into word salads. But all this to say, you will come out. I'm only halfway through the book, but so far it's quite enlightening and very insightful and very beautiful. I love beautifully written things, and this is one of those things where you get the double of that. You get a beautiful written story, which is based on true landscapes that he did visit, and simultaneously you get this parallel story of him talking about his past life before he got mentally ill and his quest for knowledge and philosophy, and touching upon all those different realms of knowledge and philosophical figures. And what's fun too is that he bridges those two at the same time. Like yesterday I was reading about how they were going up a mountain in the motorcycle and taking their time, and he was making parallels at the same time with how knowledge is, in essence, all these different mountains. And that oftentimes what's interesting is that some people, he was making an analogy of how, some people never even bother to climb mountains in life, and to even try hiking or anything that's physically challenging, which also is similar to how some people with their own minds don't want to bother thinking about things like this, such as the quest of knowledge or the quest of thinking about life, whether it be something ethical, or just thinking, what is this, or what is the meaning? Or some people, they just go around and conversations always stay at the surface, and it's like a lot of people don't want to even question these things and just live every day almost in a very automatic kind of way of not questioning anything. And yet they admire those that really go in really, really deep places with knowledge, such as when they read about their favorite author, or they're inspired, just like some people are inspired by, these public figures, say someone like Noam Chomsky, or like these days we have Jordan Peterson, for instance, who's very popularized, or we're getting thoughts of that with Jordan Peterson, and are in university, but they themselves don't want to question things or even study things or go deeper into these things, and some do. So that's just one thing I read yesterday, which I found very, very well said, which is pretty much how sometimes we read things and we want to understand deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And yeah, he made that so he parallels them sometimes. Sorry for that tangent. You're gonna get a lot of tangents. Having this, my mind is always running. I'm officially diagnosed ADHD, and It's not like a little quirky fad or a little kind of thing I'm trying to say. But yes, I go on tangents, which could be a beautiful thing or could be annoying as well. If you like to stick, I'm not going to go too far into it. But basically, how he makes parallels with both stories simultaneously. They're not just like separate, which is the story of the motorcycle, and they're not just philosophy. He bridges them together, which is nice. So the book is about 400 pages, and I'm about halfway through. And in my little notepad, I have this little notepad here, and I write my thoughts, things that I'd like to talk about during our podcast. But also, I keep notes of what I'm reading in this book. And so far, these are things that have been, that, after I was done reading a chapter, that really resonate with me and left a mark. And I was done reading a chapter. It's definitely one of those books that, like, when you're done reading a chapter, or you're done reading, you kind of put it down and you look into space, and you're like, and you actually think about these things. And so I write them down as I go, because I think they're really awe-inspiring, and they also give you a perspective that you never really thought of. Whether it's when we touch philosophical figures or perspective on life from a different dimension that he has. So, in one of the chapters, one thing that I found very interesting and also led into a quite a nice discussion with one of my good friends was, he mentions how, you have the scientific method in science, and we use the scientific method to get hypotheses, and then you test it, and then you have your experiment, and then you have all these things. And sorry, I just have to answer this. It's very rude to text, but I usually don't. So you have the scientific method, and you test, and then you think of hypotheses, and then you test, and then you have your results, and then the discussion, and it goes round and round and round. And a lot of people know that's empirical evidence when you want to test, whether it be something medical, something in physics, whatever experience there is. The scientific method is first and foremost. How we get to knowledge, for instance, how we get to how they discovered certain medications that work, or theories that were tested. Now, one thing that is interesting that he mentions, and again, this is his quest for knowledge, is how when you're testing something, an hypothesis, you have a multitude of hypotheses when you're thinking about testing something. And I'm not just talking about scientifically, but also any hypotheses on any given discipline or any given subject. But what's also interesting to think about, which he points out, is the fact that, and this is in his search towards absolute truth, is you have an hypothesis, and then as you're testing your theory or your hypotheses and all this kind of stuff, from testing that, sometimes you have a multitude of hypotheses that get generated through you testing something, and then eventually you end up having a multitude of hypotheses. And so he says, and this really makes you think, and it shows kind of like the limit of science or the limit of knowledge per se, but pretty much it's like you have a multitude of hypotheses, and then more hypotheses come as you generate more hypotheses. But the thing is, what is my cat doing, girls? But the thing is that you can't test all of them, because A, you don't have enough time to test all of them. B, you can't test every single hypothesis that you think of. It's impossible. It is clearly impossible to test every single hypothesis. So he kind of argues, well then how does one get to the truth if you can't test all hypotheses? And what kind of makes you think, and what he points out also, is the fact that you test hypotheses, and then sometimes some things are proven true. Let's say during Newton's time, or 40 years ago, let's say they found that, let's just give an example, coffee causes cancer. But then 20 years after, they found out the opposite. And then they found that there's another confounding variable that goes upon it. And then it's like that those two weren't even true like 5 years later. So it kind of leads one to think, and something he mentions, is truth simply a function of time? Is absolute truth of something? Because don't forget, simultaneously as different hypotheses get generated, and you can't test every single one, but then you test more as time goes on, you also have the expansion of science and technology, and science, technology, knowledge. If we just look at the past 10 years in technology, look, you have cars that park themselves, you have cars that literally, it's crazy. And so it leads one to think, you have the expansion of science, you have the multitude of hypotheses, you can't test every single one, and then eventually when you do start testing other ones, then you disprove the original one that you tested in the first place. And so what's interesting is it simply, and it makes you think this, is truth or absolute truth simply a function of time? Is it simply temporally dependent on time, essentially? Is truth essentially just dependent on time? Is truth actually, in other words, and phrased more beautifully, is truth simply just a function of time? And it really makes you think, and I thought about this, and it is true. Like, yet, you end up having a limit of whether it be science or any other discipline. You end up reaching a limit where it's like, and we're not following. I'm not going into a whole conspiracy thing. That's not what I'm trying to get at. But it really makes one think. We have the scientific method. And you reach the limits of that one and only, or one of the one and only ways to prove and get truth or really test something. And it's like he makes you realize the limits of knowledge. And so I found that very thought-provoking and very interesting to think about. And so he also goes into his son. At one point, they're camping outside one of the campsites, and his son basically says, "Dad, do you believe in ghosts?" And he's like, "No, because there's no proof, they don't have matter, etc., etc." But then he goes onto a tangent which touches upon what we were talking about before, hypotheses, which was kind of a segue to that. And the hypotheses, and he says, well, we could call, just like we could call a lot of things ghosts as well. For instance, would one consider gravity, or let's say some laws of physics, or laws that always existed but were kind of given a name over time, or scientifically found, or something that always existed but we never really acknowledged because either we didn't have the right language or proof of it, but as time went on, we did, and we were able to name these things with language, such as, for instance, physics, or you can name anything, physics, or certain things. If we're gonna look at music, for instance, are we gonna say that music, if we give a name to something, does it mean that it didn't exist before we could? So he uses that kind of analogy of ghost and knowledge and things that did it just not exist because we didn't have a name for it before. So it's really food for thought. What else did I really enjoy? He goes through hierarchies of knowledge. So how knowledge is pretty much an hierarchy. Well, he divides the way of looking at things, either the classical view or the romantic view. Now, the classical view is, underlying forms. Basically very analytical, very, I guess one could say it's very gray, very dull, kind of like, looking at a motherboard and like X goes with Y, very mathematical. And, or looking at a guitar and looking at it through a classical view would be, well, you have the strings that go here, and then, it makes sound because certain frequencies are made, and, the wood, in between the wood, you have a certain centimeter. One could also, you look at an ocean, for example, and the classical way of looking at the ocean would be very, well, there's H2O, the chlorine is divided into this and this molecule within it. It's blue because of the reflection and the ozone layer, and like all that very like monotone. One could say it's monotone. There's also beauty in it as well, within the classical viewpoint, just to clarify. But it's that very cold, scientific, analytical way of looking at things. And then what's really nice is you also have the romantic way of looking at things, which is, you look at the ocean and you have the reflection of water, and it's just sparkling in the sun, and it makes you feel this, you're in awe of it, because the blue is just so saturated with, the reflection of the sun or on a sunset, and it makes you appreciate its beauty, and you're just in awe of it, and it conjures all these feelings of inspiration, peace. Basically, you're so in awe with its colors and its beauty, and you look at the sand, and you just think of yourself in the world, and it has a very artistic, kind of like looking at it like a canvas, which is what the romantic viewpoint is. It's like looking at it as like a canvas, or in these two viewpoints, these two perspectives could be viewed on any object, anything you could imagine. And it's really interesting how it could really be on anything. Whether it be my phone, if I look at it through the classical viewpoint, you have all this technology within it. You have the motherboard, you have the lights, the brightness, the underlying forms, basically the textures. But then you have the romantic, or one could put in parentheses, it's like the artistic viewpoint, and you can look at it, and you have these lights, and it's in the way it holds, the way it feels, and it's almost like, one could say it's almost like a sculpture. And what's interesting as well in his quest for knowledge and truth is that he tries to bridge those two together, the romantic viewpoint and the classical viewpoint, and he finds one thing that gave him so much anxiety and what depressed him as well is the fact that those two perspectives are very, very hard to bridge. In fact, he makes it almost impossible to bridge. But that within each one have their beauty and their ugliness, their positives and their negatives. And sometimes you could almost link them together. And he describes his friend who, and the reason why it's also, I think the book is called The Art of the Motorcycle Maintenance, is like he views as his motorcycle as like an art form. And you have the classical viewpoint towards it, but you have the romantic viewpoint. And his friend, for example, is so afraid of repairing his own motorcycle because he's intimidated by all that technology, the mechanics, and basically he's intimidated by the classical way of looking at it. But he's taking more a perspective, or at least I think so, of the romantic viewpoint. And he's looking at it with such beauty, and all the connections are so beautiful, and it's so amazing how, and it's so awe-inspiring how all these little connections connect to the other one, and how, you have the throttle that connects with the engine. And anyways, I'm just going to leave you with that. And more should be discussed. And I hope you enjoyed this first podcast. And I gave you some food for thought on these things. Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe, Simply Thoughts. And also check out my band, Simply Brick. Take care.